Welcome, everybody. Jordan Bunting here with Questtec. So I'm back with another really cool podcast for you guys. So today what we're going to talk about is our Type 3A OS&Y gauge valve. So, here at Questtec, we manufacture various different types of gauge valves. We make integral bonnet gauge valves. We make union bonnet gauge valves. And the 3A is our OS&Y bolted bonnet style gauge valve. So what we're going to focus on with this podcast is just strictly that 3A type valve. So, we're just going to cover, what it is, why would you use it, what the benefits are to the type 3A, and just some, quick overview on doing a field rebuild of that valve. That's one of the big benefits of that style valve. It's easy to rebuild in the field. So, what is our Type 3A OS&Y gauge valve? So one, it's a gauge valve, and it's important to not confuse it with a gate valve. So as far as Questtec, our factory terminology, when we say gauge valve, we're talking about a set of valves that's going to be used with, a reflex or transparent sight glass. So basically it's a set of valves. So when we say, 3A gauge valve, we're talking about quantity 2 valves, 1 top valve and 1 bottom valve. And the primary feature of a gauge valve is the internal ball check. So that ball check is a safety feature of that valve. So some of the different terms for a gauge valve would be a blowout preventer, would be a ball check gauge valve, gauge cocks, sight glass valves. So all those mean the same thing. And the primary feature is that safety function of that valve is that internal ball check. So that ball check is there if the sight glass that's in between the valves, if it ever had a catastrophic blowout of the glass, that ball check would engage and cut off the flow of the process fluid through the piping outside of that broken glass. So it's a really critical safety feature. So, this 3A valve is part of our Glass Track product line, and that's our process gauge product line. So all of the gauge valves with our process gauge product line, the Glass Track, all the valves include that safety ball check as a factory standard feature. So, the Type 3A gauge valve, it's for light, medium, and heavy duty applications. So it's a very robust valve, and it's what we would use in, difficult applications, or say you had a sight glass that was very long and you needed extra support, you needed a very strong valve on the top and bottom end of that longer sight glass. That 3A valve would be ideal for that. And it's also available in different gauge connections. So like all of our valves, when you say 3AS, S would be for a screwed gauge connection. If it was a 3AU, the U would be for a union gauge connection. So we have screwed NPT gauge connections, socket weld gauge connections, union gauge connections, stuffing box, and gasketed union gauge connections. So all gauge valves, they have 3 different connection points. You have your vessel, your gauge, and your vent and drain. So part of that model number in that 3AS, that S designates that gauge connection. Say if it was a 3AU, that would be a union gauge connection. So when we do a union, that union also is available in NPT or socket weld / IPS for a welded union gauge connection. So that pretty much gives you a good overview of what that valve is. And another point of that valve is that the vessel connection standard is a solid shank connection. So unlike our type 1 and 2 valves, the type 3 has a solid shank vessel connection. So what that means is there's just no union at the vessel connection. The type 3 valve is really set up for welded vessel connection. So let's get into why you would use a 3A type gauge valve. So, by far, the biggest reason why to use one is simply put for refinery applications. Across the board throughout the U.S., globally, this is the type of valve that's preferred the most for refineries. So, one thing when you look at refinery specifications, say you look at a refinery pipe spec and you read through that pipe spec, you'll see a lot of OS&Y valves in there. So much like a gate valve, our 3A gauge valve, it's a rising stem valve. So it kind of aligns with, gate valve specs a little bit. They're both rising stem valves. So when you look at a refinery pipe spec, you look at that gate valve category, you'll see all those valves are OS&Y, or nearly all of them. Majority of those valves are going to be OS&Y. So it's just the type of valve that a refinery would want to use. Another reason to use a 3A valve would be high temperature applications. The stem threads are external on a type 3A valve, so they're away from the process heat. It would be also used where, say, along with refineries, say unions are not allowed. So, as refineries modernize their pipe specs, you'll see some refineries, they're putting verbiage in the pipe specs that say unions not allowed or unions require special approval. So, metal to metal union is pretty widely recognized as a nuisance leak point. So if you had a refinery application and the pipe spec is pretty clear where it says unions are not allowed, or you may look for the union grouping, the union listing in the pipe spec, and you'll see that there is no unions listed in the pipe spec. Well, that's because they don't want them. So some refineries that have clear pipe specs, will say right in there, unions not allowed. So that's another reason why to use that type of valve, because the vessel connection is non-union. And when you have a requirement for a flanged vessel, that aligns with the solid shank style valve. So if you have a solid shank style valve and say you do male MPT, well, it's pretty darn difficult to install that valve as an assembled gauge. So when the level gauge is assembled with the valves, the union is there to be able to rotate and screw in each connection independently, top versus bottom. So when you do a type 3A valve, it's really set up for flanged vessel connections. So that would be a reason why to use the type 3A valve if the customer is requiring, a flanged vessel. When we do a flanged vessel with a type 2 valve, you still have a union there, and the union now becomes kind of a unnecessary part of that assembly. If you have a flange, you don't need to be able to, screw it in to install it. It just bolts in. Another reason why to use a type 3A valve would be if low emissions packing is required. So, again, this kind of ties together with refinery applications and those sort of accounts. If they have low emissions requirements across the board for the whole site, this valve would be a perfect valve for them to standardize on. So with our 3A valve, we do have an option for compliance for certification to API 624. So with our type 3A valve, the low E is an option. It's not a standard part of the valve. This valve is also available in Teflon packing, and that's one of the reasons why it's not standard across the board API 624, because if us as a manufacturer, if we put Teflon packing in that valve, that would not pass API 624 testing criteria. So API 624 is a low emissions packing standard for rising stem valves. So That's a pretty common option for that valve in refineries. So benefits. So let's kind of run through some of the benefits for the Type 3A valve. So the biggest one that really, stands out to me is that it's easy to rebuild in the field. So, this Type 3A valve, it's pretty common for all welded assemblies. And along with those welded assembly comes NDEs, so non-destructive examination of the welds. So if you do have an assembly, kind of picture this. Picture a kind of a higher tier, more reliable sight glass. That would be an all welded assembly. So picture having this all welded assembly, and you need to fix the valve on the fly suddenly in the field. There's a problem with the valve, and it needs to get replaced. Well, the beautiful thing about the Type 3A valve is you can replace the top works of the valve and reuse the existing body. So if everything is all welded and the problem with the valve is in the top works, that can be easily replaced in the field. And what that does is that preserves all the existing welding and NDE. So what that's going to do is really minimize downtime. If there's a problem with the valve, they need to replace it. They can unbolt the old top works. They can unbolt the seat, install the ball check, install a replacement ball check if that's needed, install the seat, and install the top works. And we'll get into the rebuilding a little bit later. But the fact that it is easy and quick to rebuild in the field is a major advantage with that style valve. If you were to replace the whole valve and there's welding, now that slows down, the downtime. So that extends the downtime. That really slows down the rebuild at a plant. Now you have to weld, and then now you have to do NDEs again. So all that stuff is going to add time to getting a sight glass repaired and back online and back in service. Another benefit to the Type 3A valve is its offset. So in a refinery where you do get buildup inside the gauge, you do need to steam clean it every once in a while. So when you steam clean a sight glass, that's where that offset body pattern comes into play. So when you throttle steam through a sight glass, you're throttling it through the vent and drain, and that steam is going to aggressively flow through that gauge to clean it out. And you need to throttle steam through the gauge and not around the valve stem, because then you're going to damage the valve stem if you're throttling steam, through that gauge right onto that valve stem. So the benefit to OS&Y now is there's a 7/8 inch offset. So now you can steam clean the sight glass and you're not blasting steam right on the stem of that valve. So that's where that offset comes into play. So again, the Type 3A, it's a standard body is offset style. And external stem threads. So with the Type 3A valve, with it being an OS&Y, having external stem threads is a really good feature where you can spray some penetrating oil on those stem threads before you open it or close it. So those external stem threads give you the ability to lubricate that valve easily in the field. What happens with these valves is they live, 98% of their time in the open position. It's not a valve that's, they're opening and closing on a daily basis. So it's really beneficial to be able to have access to those stem threads externally. And then the stem threads are not exposed to the heat of the process, and they're not exposed to the process fluid. So if it's a corrosive application, those stem threads, the critical way of that valve to open and close, the critical mechanism there, it's external, not exposed to the process fluid, and it's further away from the process temperature. Another good benefit for the Type 3A valve, it's also rated for steam. So this valve can handle steam applications. It's rated for 1600 psi steam. So it's the same body style that we would use for our SV 1600A valve within our steam track product line. So, another benefit would be, we kind of touched on this a little bit earlier, is it's ideal for all welded applications. So, because the vessel connection is solid shank, it's non-union, it's, set up for, a socket weld flange, a weld neck flange. It's set up to have a welded vessel connection, specifically a flange. So it's the perfect valve where if you have a need for an all welded assembly that does not have unions. So that's where you would use our 3AS valve. So, again, when I say 3AS, S can be, screwed MPT, or it can be socket weld. So another option is the low emissions. We kind of touched on that. That's a huge, huge benefit for that valve. If you have low emissions requirements, typically for a rising stem valve, the requirement would be API 624. So we have this valve has been third-party certified to API 624. Questtec was actually the first level gauge manufacturer in the U.S. to have that achieve that API 624 low emissions certification. That spec came out in 2014. So, and again, low emissions kind of ties together with all welded assemblies. If you're going to do low emissions valves, it makes sense to do an all welded assembly that doesn't have unions. And as far as another benefit, we kind of touched on this already, is that it does align with refinery pipe specs. So again, when you read through refinery pipe specs, you'll see a lot of references to OS&Y. You won't see references to union bonnet valves like our Type 2 valves. So again, our Type 3A aligns with refinery pipe specs. So let's kind of wrap things up here with field rebuilds. And, again, this is a huge, huge benefit to this valve. And it's very easy to rebuild in the field. We typically don't have a lot of customers rebuilding valves because they just rather buy a new set. But in this scenario, this type of valve, our 3A, it's used with these all welded assemblies, where there is NDE done on the welds, there is certain size and class flange welded on that vessel. So what that means is when you need a replacement Type 3A with, say, an inch and a half, 300-pound flange, nobody stocks this valve with a flange already welded on the vessel. We have to fabricate these connections per order. So being able to rebuild your existing valve in the field does minimize downtime, does save the plant, a lot of time. So just to kind of run through how easy it is to rebuild, there's 4 bonnet bolts that are removed, and that allow you to remove the whole top works of the valve. So you basically have 2 parts. You have the top works of the valve and you have the body of the valve. So once you remove that top works, down in the valve, that's where you'll see the seat. And that seat also unbolts from the body of the valve. And then behind that seat, that's where the ball check is. So you actually access that ball check inside the valve, through that bolted bonnet top works of that valve. So when you go to reassemble that valve, you would put your ball check in, and then you would install the seat. And that seat torques to 30 foot-pounds. And once that seat is installed, then you can install the replacement top works. So you would just use a new yoke gasket, and you'd put that new yoke gasket in there, and you would place the top works on and screw in the bolts. So those bolts you would tighten down in 3 to 4 passes with a final torque value of 35 foot-pounds. So, I mean, that's, not some huge, high special torque value. It's only 35 foot-pounds to rebuild that valve. So one of our competitors, they sell a valve. It's got a torque value, something ridiculous like 500 foot-pounds to torque down a packing gland inside the valve. So that would not be field repairable, or would be very, very challenging to field repair. So with the Type 3A valve, you have that big benefit is you're talking about 30 foot-pounds for the seat, 35 foot-pounds for the bonnet bolts. Really, really quick and easy to rebuild. And again, that's gonna save the plant in downtime. So that's about it. That's our Type 3A valve, kind of what it is, why would you use it, and some of the benefits. So again, Jordan Bunting here with Questtec. Really hope you guys got something out of this podcast. And if you need anything further, got any other questions on this Type 3A valve, feel free to reach out to us. Thanks a lot, everybody. Have a good day.